basically got pulled a few slides together to give you an idea about who I am, how I got into this job, what my job entails, what it actually looks like, because I was thinking that that's something, when I was your age, I had a vague idea I wanted to do science and do research, but I didn't actually know what it consisted of, and then my route into my career. And I think I finish on a few things of what I think I'd have liked to have known at your age that I didn't. So a little bit about my research. So as you said, I'm interested in individual differences. So whilst we're all human and we walk upright and we use language to communicate, we differ in really important and interesting ways. So I'm particularly interested in why children differ in their academic achievements. So how well they do at school, how long they do at school, how long they stay in education, and also thinking about why some children develop differently. So why some children go on to develop atypically and develop disorders such as autism and ADHD. And I'm particularly interested in the biological origins of these differences. So we know that we differ for genetic and non-genetic reasons, so nature and nurture, but I'm particularly focused on understanding the genetic components. I have children there as well because I tend to study children, but that is changing slightly. So again, just to say here, I'm interested in the biological origins of these differences, so I'm often based in the lab. So my PhD research, I was in the wet lab collecting DNA samples from individuals, analysing DNA. So a lot of my research is really looking at the level of the cell and looking at the information encoded and contained in the cells, and thinking about how your DNA sequence, so your sequence of A's, G's, C's and T's that you're inherited from your parents, how that's ultimately influencing behaviour in groups of people. So trying to make these steps, linking kind of genes to brain function and brain structure and eventual outcomes. So kind of the bread and butter of my research, my kind of day-to-day is using an approach where we characterise genetic variation in large groups of individuals. So again, we all have a human genome that looks roughly the same, but it does differ in important ways. And we now know how to look at those differences, and we compare those differences to differences in outcome. So for example, how long you stay in school, how well you might do on an IQ test, whether you develop autism or not. So I take groups of individuals and I look at these changes, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved in some work that's actually been able to identify genes and genetic variants that seem to be associated with these kind of complex, higher level cognitive outcomes. One of the things we discovered quite early on, which kind of makes this job quite exciting, is we didn't actually find what we expected to find. We thought we'd find a handful of genes that explained behaviour, and it's not the case at all. It's actually turned out to be quite tricky. Number one, it's turned out to be quite tricky to identify these regions, and also once you identify them, it's been quite hard to actually make these steps up to the brain. So what are the actual mechanisms? So I've tried to illustrate that here with this nice cartoon I find, which I think neatly summarises some of my early research. You find these links between DNA and outcome, but what's happening in the middle? There has to be a mechanism. It's not magical. So again, a lot of my work again is based in the lab and looking at things called looking at what your genes are doing in your body and how they might change. Have you heard about things like gene expression? I don't know if that's, yeah, I've got some nods, so that's good. So looking at gene expression, but basically looking about how the information encoded in your DNA is used by the body. And then also, as a geneticist, I try to shy away as much as possible. Initially I did from the environment, but we know the environment's important, and increasingly I'm trying to incorporate that into my research. So we know that genes don't operate in isolation because we're just not walking around in a bubble. They're operating in the cellular environment and in the environments we find ourselves in. So increasingly I'm thinking about how genes and behaviour, how genes and the environment are linked and interact. So why do we change our environments? How do we shape our own environments? Or how do environments actually change our gene function? And then finally, the kind of most recent research I'm involved with is then thinking about, typically when we're looking at these outcomes up here, we're looking in adults using standard kind of psychometric measures such as IQ tests or questionnaires. but we're really interested in what's going on in the brain, and particularly what might be going on in the brain quite early in development. So rather than just looking over here in adulthood, but start thinking what might be going on early to change the developmental trajectories of our cognition and why we differ. So I'm involved in some really cool research now over at the Baby Lab, where we're looking at brain function in really early babies, so from 3 to 6 months of age. We can't ask babies questionnaires, we can't give them cognitive tests, but we can look in their brain and measure brain activity. We can see what they're attending to if you present them with material. We can speak to their parents and ask them questions. So we're increasingly looking at trying to think about all of this in a developmental context. So that's broadly what I do, and to try and give an illustration that it's always changing, but it's always interesting. And then I didn't know quite where to put this, so I put this up here now, and just to say that I'm not just my job. So often I'm kind of come to give talks and it's all about the research, but I do think it's important that you know that all the scientists you'll meet today are people, and they have lives, and we do have lives, and we do things. So I am a mother, I have a family. I like doing lots of activities. I'm not good at some things, I'm good at other things, but this is just up here to say that, I like to think I have a life as well. It is possible. So I was then just going to talk a little bit about what my job involves, because again, when I was your age, I had a vague idea that I wanted to do science. And if you'd asked me what a scientist did, I could probably at a push say they probably do experiments. They might be in the lab with a pipette and a white coat on, but beyond that I didn't really have a concrete idea of what goes on behind the curtain and what that's actually like. So a big component of my work and my day-to-day life is research. So I'm paid by my institution, by Birkbeck University, to conduct research. So you have a great deal of autonomy on this. They don't tell me what I have to research. You choose yourself what interests you and what you want to research. And that's all about thinking about what your question is. So again, I'm interested in the biological basis of individual differences. So I've got to think about, how do I best approach that question? Where are the gaps in the knowledge in the general field of behaviour genetics? What's left to be discovered, and how can I start to plug those gaps? What can I bring to the table? So you plan your research, you conduct your research, you conduct the experiments, and you collect the data. As part of that as well, you need to generate funding. So sometimes that comes from the institution you're in, but often you have to apply to charities or independent funding bodies and say, I want to do this experiment. I think I can do it really well. Can you give me some money, please? When we find something, again, it's no good that I'm sitting in the lab quietly on my own and diligently with my test tubes and my pipette, finding wonderful things but keeping them to myself. So it's really important that we put that out there in the public domain so it gets peer reviewed by other scientists. Are our scientific findings robust? How are they adding to what we already know? Do they replicate? Do other people see the same things? But also for public engagement, so for the public to know what you're doing. So increasingly my research has relevance for educators and teachers. If I'm finding genetic differences between children that's impacting how well they do at school, how might a teacher use that information? Is that going to change how they teach or teaching policy, or how they even view individual differences in the classroom? A second big component, because I'm basically employed also to teach by Birkbeck University, so probably about a third of my time is spent teaching and mentoring students. So I am up here with classes of up to kind of 150 undergrad students, not quite looking as engaged as you, often looking a little bit sleepy and bored sometimes. So a big component is teaching, marking, basically mentorship, and passing that information along. And then finally, for academic positions at university, there's something called service, which is kind of a bit of a vague term, but it's a general kind of service to scholarship and service to science. So as an academic, you're expected to review other people's research, You'll organise conferences and seminars and workshops. You'll sit on committees and help make strategic decisions about what the college is going to focus on, or mental health strategies for the coming years. So those are the three kind of broad components we have in the job. And I'd just like to say that there is I don't think there's a typical day. That's one of the things I like about my job. Each week changes slightly. Whilst I have to do an element of all those things, the ratios change each week and with certain months of the year. But if you're interested, there's, I think if you just search for me in Birkbeck, there's a little blog I've written about a day in the life and the general things I get up to. And then a little bit, if I've got time, I'll just talk a little bit about my path and how I got here. It wasn't straightforward. I didn't have, certainly I had friends, and I have colleagues now who knew very early on exactly what it is they wanted to do. They wanted to do clinical psychology, or they wanted to do this. I didn't have that, and it worried me a lot. I remember distinctly at being around your age, kind of 15, 16, I was always asked, what do I want to do? And I'd give an answer because it wasn't acceptable not to give an answer. But really I didn't quite know. But I will say that quite early on I was always interested in why I differed from my family. So I wasn't raised by my biological parents, I was raised in foster care, and I always noticed those differences growing up. So I differed physically from my family. I kind of got that, right? I understood why that was the case. But I also differed academically. I was more academic, I was interested in very different things. I seemed to be doing okay at school, and I couldn't understand why that made me different from my siblings. Was it because of how I was being raised, the school I was going to, or was it because of the genes I'd inherited from my biological parents? So I had this kind of playing on my background. In general, I did like science. I enjoyed science as a subject. It was something that interests me. So that's kind of where I put my energies. And basically then when I applied to go to university, again, I knew I wanted to go to university. I didn't quite understand what university was, or what. I understood the process and what you needed to do, but I didn't really, again, I didn't have that insight. I wasn't in an academic family. I didn't know about writing cover letters, going for interviews. My interviews were a car crash because I had no preparation. I didn't know what to say in university interviews. But thankfully, I did get there. So I ended up doing an undergraduate degree at King's College London in human biology. And again, I kept it really broad because I knew I wanted something to do with science and biology. I was quite interested in psychology as well. And then during the course of my undergraduate studies, I had a lecture that I remember quite clearly on genetics, and it blew my mind. We didn't have many courses on genetics. We had this one kind of 6-week course, and it just opened my mind basically to the possibilities. And I decided that was what I was really interested in. That held the key. And then I went on, based on that, I went on and did a master's in human molecular genetics at Imperial London. And I will say that's for me where it really, that changed my course, and that's kind of why I ended up here. It was hard work, it was absolutely hard work, but my master's really was kind of what opened the door for me for science, was seeing the kind of people who worked in science, being in a wet lab and doing scientific experiments under the supervision of a great professor, seeing that it was possible, and also recognising that these other scientists weren't superheroes. They were clever, they worked hard, but I could be one of them. I wasn't someone different, and I shouldn't think of myself differently. And then I went on to do my PhD under the supervision of Professor Robert Plomin, also at King's College London. Got my PhD, yay! And then took up a lectureship post at Birkbeck in 2010, and I've been there since. Hopefully soon to become reader, make those next steps. I'm not quite a professor yet. And then just to end on a few things, so things I wish I knew at age 16. One of them, again, it kind of relates to this idea of writing cover letters for your university applications and just general professionalism. I didn't know things about email etiquette or how to construct a nice email, how to approach people. And also planning ahead. You know, if I wanted to do something or I saw an opportunity, I couldn't just contact someone 2 days before the deadline and expect miracles or something to happen. And now I'm on the other side of the fence. I see that for other people. I can see that kind of how they approach you. How, you know, if students or postdocs are writing to you and saying, could you support my application for this, or could you perhaps provide some training in this area? I'm more than willing to help people, but I need notice. You can't say, oh, this is actually due next week. Do you think we could do this together? So just this kind of general kind of contacts, and make the most of contacts. So make the most of the people you meet today and keep those contacts in your purse, because it will be really, really useful. Academics are not superheroes, so kind of relating to this idea that we're not a different species. There are many very brilliant scientists, but what's in common is they're very engaged, they work hard, and of course they're smart, but they're passionate, and they're generally a very interesting group of people. And also there are different routes into science. So again, some of the best academics I've met within my field didn't study biology or genetics as their undergraduate. My current PhD student did philosophy. There's a great, or several academics in my department who started off as musicians or studying music. It's kind of normal not to know exactly what you want to do at 16, so my advice would be to follow what you're good at and what you find interesting, because if you find it interesting, it makes your life so much easier. Don't put professional limits on yourself, so don't think, well, I can't do this because of this. There's always going to be roadblocks, either from externally or for certain circumstances, but don't let that roadblock be you. So see these things as hoops to be jumped through, and just kind of hold your breath and do it anyway. And then you're not going to be thinking about this at all, but I see it every day about thinking about, if you do want to work in science, it can be a full, you know, it's full-time, it's demanding, it's busy, it's very engaging and very enjoyable. But it takes a lot. It's a lot of time, and the trainings. You know, you take a lot of time training and learning and getting here. If you want a family, it's more than possible, but it has to be part of a team effort. So you're not going to be thinking about this yet, but if you are thinking about having a family, or that's being in your future, make sure it's with someone who's going to support you and is going to pull their weight.